We could title this evening's sermon, which is once again from our lessons from the life of Moses, we could title it Moses Rejected. We find this, of course, in Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 to 22, those verses we just read together. Last week, we saw how Moses' parents sought to save him from being killed by placing him in that little ark and floating him on the river. And sure enough, none other than Pharaoh's daughter finds him and basically adopts him as her own. And then all of a sudden, it reads, he was an adult. So we're told nothing of those intervening years. However, given that he was then this son of a princess, it's quite reasonable to assume that he had a very good Egyptian education. And of course, he would not have gone without the niceties of being brought up in the royal household. And yet we are told, when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens. Now, given that his upbringing from 3 months old was with the Egyptians, we might think, well, how come he thought that the Hebrews were his brethren? But of course, we've only got to go back to verse 8 of this chapter to find the answer to that. Because, well, in verse 7, Moses' sister had asked Pharaoh's daughter, after she'd found the baby, she asked her if she wanted a Hebrew nurse for the boy. And in verse 8 we read, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. So Moses' nurse was in fact his biological mother. And of course, that being the case, it beggars belief, doesn't it, that she would not have told him about his heritage. I don't know if you read the Narnia Chronicles, but I strongly suspect that in the third book, in Prince Caspian, C.S. Lewis got the idea of Caspian schooling from this passage. Anyway, Moses, he's aware then that the Hebrews are his natural, wider family and that they were being hard done by. Moses, he's now 40 years old, so he's been in the palace for 40 years, less 3 months. We know he was 40 from Acts 7, verse 23, where Stephen, who was the first Christian martyr, he said to the Jewish council, he said, and when he, that is Moses, when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And in fact, in the same speech, Stephen said, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in word and in deeds. So just now I said, well, it's reasonable to assume he had a good Egyptian education, but we don't have to assume it because it's taught us in the Bible. So at the age of 40, out he went. Presumably when he was younger, his mother had told him of the way that the Hebrews were treated by the Egyptians. And yet I strongly suspect that he was shocked at what he saw when he saw it himself. And what he saw was an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrews. Now this world is littered with examples of oppressors mistreating terribly those whom they oppress. Anyway, seeing this, it would appear, it made Moses' blood boil. Because what did he do? He killed the Egyptian. Now, I hesitate to call it murder, although some may well call it that, and presumably Pharaoh thought of it like that. But see, I have to ask myself, does an oppressed nation, an oppressed people, do they have the right to rise up against their oppressors if they are being unjustly treated? Now, I'm aware that there are those who justify terrorism by saying that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and I wouldn't want to be like that. But if I were to ask, do the Ukrainians have the right to fight back against the Russians? Most people will answer, well, of course they do. And if I were to ask, does the UK have the right to support the Ukrainians? Most people will say, well, yes, of course they do. So really, what is different here with Moses supporting the Hebrews who are being oppressed by the Egyptians? Well, I don't want us to get bogged down with that, but that is how I look upon this. Anyway, Moses, he sees what's going on. He had a good look round. He thought they were alone, and so he jumped the Egyptian. Having killed him, he buried him in a shallow grave in the sand somewhere. And once again, it is Stephen in the New Testament that tells us Moses thought that his brethren would recognize him as a saviour sent to them from God. Also, in the book of Hebrews, in the New Testament, we are told that Moses, he cast off his Egyptian inheritance in favour of suffering affliction with the people of God. And I think we can safely say that it was from this first day that he went out that came to pass. So he goes out a second day. Now, whether that's the next day or not, I can't say, but another day he went out. And this time he finds two Hebrews are fighting with each other. And that's the thing, sin will do that to us. Even in the depths of external troubles, we can still pile on more trouble for ourselves. I don't know if you know, but it is one of the saddest stories of the British Civil War era that soon after the restoration of Charles II to the English throne, about 2,000 very godly ministers were ejected from the Church of England with absolutely no pension or compensation for their loss of living. And they were ejected for refusing to sign up to the Act of Conformity. Now, of course, that was sad in and of itself. But it was particularly sad because in the lead up to that act, the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, they all had opportunity for input into what would happen, but because they couldn't agree with each other, and they couldn't agree with each other on things that you and I would probably consider secondary matters, so because of that, not only did they gain nothing, but they lost everything. That's what I mean, how bad we can be at piling more miseries upon ourselves. And if that's how it can be then within the church, no wonder things can be so bad in the world. Anyway, Moses says to the one Hebrew who's evidently in the wrong, he says, "Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow?" You and I, we'd probably say, "Why are you hitting your friend?" And that would appear to be a genuine inquiry. Why on earth are you fighting each other when you both have bigger problems to face? But the response he got, he probably did not expect. The perpetrator responded, "Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killed the Egyptian?" Sort of thing we hear all the time. Well, maybe not all the time, but a lot. Who do you think you are coming round here shouting the odds? It is a very common response. Anyone seeking to do good often finds that they are facing pushback. I mean, bizarre, but that's what the world is like. And that is just another example of the perversity of the human heart. Well, here is Moses then with the best intentions in the world. He's being rejected by his own. They might have said to him, "Well, look, if you really want to help, why don't you use your influence in the palace to have our burdens eased. But no, he's rejected outright. He's rejected as little more than an interfering busybody. But I think it was what this Hebrew man went on to say that really shocked Moses, because he said, "Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses thought he had done the thing in secret, but it appears to be now to be the talk of the town. And quite naturally, Moses is fearful. What will be the outcome of this? Well, the outcome was that Pharaoh wanted to execute Moses. I mean, Pharaoh knew that Moses was not a genuine Egyptian. He knew that he didn't really deserve a place in the royal household. And so the text indicates that Pharaoh had no compunction. He just issued the death sentence. So Moses is not only rejected by his fellow Hebrews, he's rejected by the royal throne, by Pharaoh. But as we read, Moses, he managed to get away, and he flees under the sentence of death to Midian. Remember last week we looked at the birth of Moses, and we said he was born under the sentence of death. Well, now here he is once again under the sentence of death. So he flees to Midian. Now that was no mean trip. It was I think it's around about 300 miles. 300 miles. No public transport, remember. And when he gets there, we're told that he sits by a well. And it was at this well that 7 sisters come along to get water for their father's flock. But some shepherds, presumably men, shepherds in that region, well, they think that they should have first dibs on the water. And under the assumption that might is right, these shepherds prevent the women from getting at the well. But just as he had done back in Egypt, Moses stands up for the oppressed against the bullies. And that itself shows strength of character. He's a foreigner there in Midian, though he might not have looked like one to those shepherds, but he was a foreigner, and he is but one man. But that said, right is always right, and wrong is always wrong. And Moses knew and acted on that principle. I think we too often act upon the principle of, "Oh, I don't want to get involved, thank you very much." But when we do that, that's all that is needed for wickedness to flourish. And given that later on we're told that Moses was the meekest man on earth, that's what it says in Numbers 12 and verse 3, well, I do rather think then that he puts us to shame. Anyway, he helps these women, and he waters the flock for them. When the sisters tell their father about this event, he says, in effect, "Well, why haven't you brought him back to eat with us then?" So they go back and they get Moses. And Moses lived with the man who we discover is called Reuel. Now at some point, Reuel gives one of his daughters, Zipporah, gives him to be the wife of Moses. And together they have their first son, whom Moses names Gershom. Gershom means foreigner. And he gives him this name because he said, "I've been a stranger in a strange land." And so what I would say is that in this passage, Moses can be seen as a type of Christ in at least 4 ways. Because first of all, he pictures Christ for us in being this stranger in a strange land. Jesus, of course, was very human. He was as human as you and me. But there was something very different about his humanity to that of ours. Jesus was unique. He was and is the only human being that has walked this earth and has not sinned. Sin was totally alien to him. It's written of him in 1 Peter 2 and verse 22. It says, "Who did no sin, neither was guile, guile is deceit, neither was guile found in his mouth. And in Hebrews 4 verse 15 we read, he was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. There's been no one else like that. Indeed, the Apostle Paul, he wrote in Romans 3:23 and 5:12, he wrote, all have sinned. And to emphasize the point, he declared, there is none righteous, no, not one. And he was quoting Psalm 53 there. Jesus was unique in that he did not fall into that mould. He was a lamb without spot or blemish. That's how he's described. So in a world full of sinners, this sinless one stood out as a stranger in a strange land. But that does rather lead us to the question, well, how come he was without sin? And to answer that, we need to understand how he came to be a human being. But first, how did you and I become human beings? Well, we are humans because our parents were humans. And they were humans because their parents were human. And we could trace our ancestry back to Noah and beyond him to Adam, the first human. We gain our humanity by what we call natural generation. Jesus, however, is not just a human being. He is the eternal Son of God. He did not become man through natural generation, but by supernatural means. He took on a human nature and was born of the Virgin Mary. So he is God incarnate. Therefore, he was unique in that way too. As he walked the earth, he was again, in that sense, a stranger in a strange land. You know, there's that Christmas hymn that says he came down to earth from heaven, and that is absolutely true. That is what he did. Although his human nature was genuinely, truly human, it was free from all taint of sin that Adam, the first man, our federal head, as we can call him, brought upon us all. And being free from sin made him perfectly equipped for dealing with sin. You see, all of us, we are all under God's perfect judgment because of our sin. Jesus suffered God's judgment when he hung dying upon the cross because of the sins of others. He died in the place of his people to set them free from their condemnation. Nobody else has suffered and died in the place of others because nobody else could. And so Jesus, he's unique in that way as well. Now, a second way that Moses pictures Christ for us in this passage is like this. You see, when Moses left the royal court of Egypt and entered the strange land of Midian, just like when he was born, he came with the sentence of death upon his head. When Jesus gave up the sapphire-paved courts of heaven for a stable floor, as we often sing then, well, he also came with a sentence of death on his head. I say this because he didn't take on a human nature just to see what it was like. There was a purpose to this. He came to fulfill a plan. His death on Calvary's cross was not an afterthought, and it most certainly was not a mistake. In Philippians 2 verse 8, Paul writes, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. And the Apostle Peter writes that we were redeemed with the precious blood of Christ as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. And he goes on and says, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. That's what we read in 1 Peter chapter 1. Jesus came into this world as a man for the very purpose of dying. He died to set his people free from sin. In Luke 9 and verse 51 we read, "And it came to pass, when the time was come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem." You see the force of those words? Nothing would deter him from going to Jerusalem, for he knew that it was there that he would be crucified. In Acts 2 and verse 23, Jesus being delivered up to be crucified is referred to as the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. Just think about that. God had a plan to rescue people from their sin right from the very beginning. Now, of course, you might be wondering why you or anyone else needs rescuing from your sin. What's the big deal, you might ask? Well, if you're a Christian, you know what a big deal sin is. But if you're not a Christian, I must tell you that sin is a much bigger deal than you can imagine. The thing is that we've got used to sin. It's been our constant companion all our lives. And it's been the constant companion of all humans since soon after the creation of the first man. It is so all-pervasive that we might not even notice it anymore. If someone tells us we are a sinner, we might respond, well, what's that then? But sin is a big problem because it is, in essence, warfare against God. It is a determined refusal not to live as God requires and expects us to live. And like I just said, you may have got used to sin. You may have got so used to it that you don't see it in that light. But that is what sin is. And importantly, that is how God sees it. And being at war with God is not a good place to be. Can you win? Can you win? Of course you can't. Are you all-knowing? Could you outfox God by coming up with a clever strategy? Well, you know the answer to that. With your limited knowledge, how could you possibly outmaneuver someone that knows everything? Are you all-powerful? Is there no one who can stand against you? Even if you're very strong, I'm sure you know and realise that there's someone else in the world who is stronger than you. How strong is your strength then compared to the one who is all-powerful? No, you cannot win in a war with God. And if you lose that, which is the natural outcome, well, then you will feel the just condemnation of God in an eternal hell. That is why sin is a big deal and why you need rescuing from it. And that is why Jesus came into the world, to die the death that the sins of others deserved. But then a third way that Moses pictures Jesus for us in his going about doing good. As I said, Moses, he entered Midian with the sentence of death upon him. And no doubt there, when he sat by the well, he would have been tired and weary after his not inconsiderable journey. You know, we might understand, might we not, that if he had determined to take care of himself before anything else, well, I understand that. But no, despite his own condition, the first thing we read of in this new land is him doing good to 7 sisters who were being tyrannised and harassed by some intimidating aggressors. His behaviour in that land was the same as it was in the land from which he had come. In Acts 14 and verse 17, we read of the Apostle Paul speaking to a group of people, telling them to turn from their old ways unto the living God. And then he says of God in that verse, he says, nevertheless, he, that is God, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons. And then we read of Jesus, God incarnate, that he walked the earth and he went about doing good. That's what it says in Acts 10:38. Moses' behaviour as a stranger in a strange land was the same as it had been in Egypt. Jesus' behaviour on earth as a stranger in a strange land was the same as it always had been, going about doing good. And Jesus did good in many, many ways. He healed many sick people. He even raised some people from the dead. There were those who suffered from demon possession, and he delivered them. But most importantly of all, he put above his healing ministry, as we've been looking at in the mornings, he put above all that the preaching of good news. But he freely met with the cast-offs of society, and he taught them. He taught great crowds, and he met with small groups. He welcomed people when they came to him. He was genuinely compassionate toward all those that were considered as little more than refuse at that time. And he rebuked the religious elite for their behaviour towards others. He rebuked them as hypocritical oppressors. They were religious for what they could get out of it. And Jesus knew that such people were only leading others away from God. And he let them know that they were not going to get away with that. And of course, Jesus' greatest act of compassion was in his dying for sinners. But God commendeth his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. What a horrendous thing Jesus went through to save his people. And yet he did so willingly. He did so willingly. But then fourthly, Moses pictures Jesus for us in his rejection. You know that it was prophesied of the Messiah about 700 years in advance that he would be despised and rejected of men. It says that in Isaiah 53 verse 3. Well, about 700 years before that, Moses depicted this rejection. As we saw, his own people rejected him. Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? And John in the opening of his gospel record says of Jesus, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. John 1:11. And we know certainly the religious elite wanted nothing to do with him. Indeed, they became the very people who delivered Jesus to the Romans to be crucified. But then we saw that Moses was rejected in the royal palace, which had been his home for 40 years. It says, Pharaoh sought to slay Moses. And you know how when Jesus was crucified, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? At that point, Jesus was rejected from the courts of heaven for the very reason that he was bearing the sins of his people. God, we are told in Habakkuk 1:13, is of purer eyes than to behold evil and cannot look on iniquity. Iniquity is what sin is. Jesus' unseen suffering was far greater than his seen suffering. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is not so that I can end on a dour note. I'm telling you this because I know you may want to reject him. I mean, that is the natural reaction of sinful people. But not everybody does. That passage that says he came unto his own and his own received him not, that goes on to say, but as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. You see, no one apart from yourself is forcing you to reject Jesus. And you so need to receive him. You need to believe in him. You need to believe that he alone can save you from your sins. And if you do that, in doing that, you will become a child of God. And that means that not only will your sins have been forgiven, not only will they have been forgiven and paid for, it means that God will have adopted you as one of his own. The death of Jesus will bring you new life, and such life as will last for all eternity. So don't reject him. Don't despise him. Instead, be like this Midianite Reuel, the way that he was with Moses. Receive Christ with open arms and an open heart. Amen.